reasons. For anybody who are descendants of Cherokee people, even Eastern Band folks out here, very often we descend from people who don't have clean and neat histories of Cherokee removal. So I descend from people who were forcibly removed, and I descend from old settlers. So my own family history isn't told through a kind of singular narrative of just the Trail of Tears. That leaves out a part of my own family history. And so what does that do to our own understandings of who we are when we have to forget about one side of our experience of removal to the West, or the conditions under which that happened? And we have to focus on 1838 to 1839. Now I want to stop and say 1838 and 1839 forced removal is a profound consequence, both to Cherokee people and to the history of the United States. And I don't want to undercut that. I simply want to say that we've got to tell ourselves more complicated stories about history. And this is one of those. So if we think about Ayoka in bigger ways, and think about her experiences of her childhood and of her relationship to her father, she becomes kind of a generational bridge. Her grandmothers grew up in East Tennessee, in those Overhill regions. They were very much rooted in that turmoil of the 18th century. Her father was born in the years leading up to American Revolution. These are people who have experienced profound change, and to suggest that those grandparents and her father didn't share stories of that history, didn't tie her to those Overhill towns, that defies what I know about the stories we understand of our own families. So she becomes kind of this generational bridge between a moment where Cherokee communities continue to build and rebuild in exactly the same ways they had for millennia, to a period where her own father is building a cabin in a totally new style that matches what the settlers are doing. But he comes from a community that continued to rebuild and rebuild again in the exact same ways they had for millennia. So he made a change, but he understood the older continuities. So additionally, she's linking these Overhill towns to these Chickamauga towns, and then when she goes west, she's bridging this east-west divide, this removal divide. And if we think about the fact that she goes early, she's there quite literally to greet the people who are forcibly removed in that 1838 to 1839 moment. She sees those arrivals. We don't have to have documents to know that's true. She's there. People are rebuilding in her community. So whether that is a way in which she's offering food quite literally, or whether she's bearing witness to forced removal, those realities are things we need to contend with. Additionally, I want us to think about her as both the child of Sequoyah, but also of her mother, also of Cherokee women. That she is not just Sequoyah's daughter, she is connected to a larger body of Cherokee women, grandmothers, maternal lines, and she is somebody who's exploring new intellectual worlds, quite literally through the syllabary, but also when she arrives in the West and has a landscape that very few Cherokee people have seen yet, and she's exploring that landscape long before those 16,000 Cherokee people arrive under forced removal. So why can't we envision her as somebody who's an explorer of all sorts of new intellectual worlds? The other way that I had to inform myself all about my own work is that archaeology, I've read a lot of the TVA reports, I've read a lot of the archaeological reports that have come out of this region more recently. What I often find about that archaeology is that it is incredibly dehumanizing. You know, it's bones, it's body positions, it's grave goods. It is a kind of deconstructed world from humanity. And I'm a historian. I think about people. I think about the activities and actions of people. And so I needed a way to think through the archaeology, which I knew to be helpful, but I also knew to have its limitations. And so I looked to people that I respect, that could aid me, and that offered models for this. So I should add, when I started thinking about the girls, I didn't realize, Janet Spector, who's on the far end of this, she kind of led the way of kind of feminist archaeology, but she actually wrote a book about the Dakota and used a girl in order to describe an awl, which was a tool used that she understood to be a tool that women used. And so she reconstructs a kind of archaeological world in order to make us think about archaeology and the role that women needed to be within those archaeological records themselves, that often foregrounded and focused on the activities of men. Candy Hollenbach is just across the mountains at University of Tennessee, Knoxville, was a colleague of mine, but she also, along with a co-author, Stephen Carmody, wrote an essay where they're thinking about Cherokee indigenous foodways in the South more broadly, and they also used a girl to think through what's being gathered, what's being eaten, what's being prepared. So I am in no way original in the fact that I did this. So even though I didn't know it at the time, nothing we do is really original. Somebody's already been that creative before us. So but I appreciate that I had these models to kind of guide me and help me as I thought through this. The third person on the screen is Tim Bowman, and I also included Brett Riggs, who's just been a part of my life since I was in graduate school. This is out at Watauga, along with the Watauga dog of the summer. But these are folks that have helped me think through the archaeology, and I'm going to say more about Tim Bowman in particular, because, and I'm going to come back to Tim, but I also want to talk about the role that Cherokee Master Artists play in how I think about this work. So this is Lisa Rutherford. She often comes out this way for various events over at Museum of the Cherokee People. She comes regularly to Sequoia Birthplace. She's a potter. She does feather cape making. But I asked her at one point if she could describe the feather cape making process to me. And I'm not an artist. I don't work with my hands in that way. I don't sew, I don't knit, I don't do any of that. And so I have a great appreciation for people that do that work, but it is not something I am compelled by. It's not something I desire to do, even as I respect and can appreciate the folks who do that. And I've known Lisa for a long time, but one of the things that I was thinking about is that we have the evidence of feather capes is few and far between, in part because the material breaks down. So the fact that we have a few feather capes is pretty extraordinary because these are often the things that we don't have in the records materially. So Lisa was able to kind of learn to reconstruct, learn to make feather capes as an adult, and used some of these feather capes, was able to work with them, both pieces that were in Washington, D.C., pieces that have been kind of kept in the community. But one of the things that she described was the soreness of her fingers from tying on the feathers. Now, why do I care about this? I'll tell you why I care about this. So feather capes were not ubiquitous. They were used for ceremonial purposes. They weren't worn by everyone, which means there wasn't kind of constant supply of feather capes. We didn't need every woman in the community to constantly be sitting around creating feather capes. Everybody had to learn pottery. It was ubiquitous. Everybody needed to have some knowledge of pottery. But not everybody needed to be expert in feather cape making. Just wasn't a need. So I thought about the ways that, the physical practice of feather cape making. Lisa makes a lot of them, but her fingers get sore. And that feels like a pretty human experience of something that you don't have to do often, right? You're never going to have calloused fingers because you're just not doing that activity enough. And that's true today, and it would have been true 250 years ago. And also that not everybody would have been an expert in this. So who do you look to? How do you learn feather cape making if you're a little girl 250 years ago and your grandmother isn't the one who's the expert in this, right? But community design at that time enabled everybody to kind of see what everybody else was doing. You know, towns are built around a common square. There are pathways between houses. So little girls could see the feather cake making happening in their orbits and kind of position themselves, get close to, model, learn from, try to copy those activities. And we do have other archaeologists who kind of looked at how did people learn skill sets. Well, very often children just sat in close proximity and watched. That's true even today. Anybody who's learned anything from watching a YouTube video. I don't particularly do well at that, but lots of people do. You can sit and you can watch and you can learn to do something. And that's kind of the basis of human learning, really until relatively recent times. Sitting, watching, listening, practicing, taking this discarded materials in order to become an expert, in order to be entrusted with the actual cake making. And so Lisa helped me kind of reconceive, here's somebody living today who helped me think through something. She didn't even know it. I just did a talk last week in Oklahoma, and she said, I finally understand why you needed me to do that, why you wanted me to describe this process. She said, I finally get it. And I was like, I'm so glad. But these are the kinds of ways that I wanted to bring both archaeology together with master artists in order to think about what we can know about an earlier moment. So I'm happy. They're also, which is great, this is Megan King. She's got a PhD in anthropology at Tennessee, but she's now working at Tennessee in a totally different office, so didn't go into to archaeology. But she did a dissertation when she was at Tennessee with Roger and Shauna Kane. And Roger is a citizen of the United Padua Band, and his wife and partner, Shauna Kane, is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And they specialize in river cane and basketry. And Megan specializes in lithics. I wanted to know how stone tools were used in earlier moments. So she took all of these lithic materials out to Oklahoma to these river cane basket makers and said, I want to see how you work with these. Can you show me how you would process cane if you were working with these old tools? And again, one of the things that stuck out to me was that Roger and Shauna both had particular stone tools that they liked better because they fit their hands better. And for any of us ladies out there who've had to use tools that don't meet that are just too big for us, that don't fit us the way they should, or that the tools you use, and all you men know this too, the tools you use matter. You need the right tools. And my daughter was in Montessori for a while, and one of the things that Montessori really pushes is having adult materials but child size. So my daughter worked side by side with my dad on projects when she was really little because she had real tools that were her size. And so then I thought about the tools that Cherokee people would have been using at any moment. If you're a kid who has to process deer hides, then you want to make sure you get that deer bone that works the best in your hand. You want to make sure that using an adult tool is not going to be as efficient as having one that fits your particular needs. So are you going out and finding shells? You're eyeing those shells because that's the shell that's going to work the best for what you need to do. That's the stone that's going to work the best. And that enabled me to kind of rethink an earlier moment. How do children pick tools? They find the ones that fit their hands. Using master artists from today to think about an earlier moment and what would have been almost certainly the process of trying to do the best you can at the activities before you. I listened to other Cherokee people. So for those of us living in this area, many of us know about the remember the removal bike ride that takes place every summer. Eastern Band riders ride with Cherokee Nation riders, and they replicate our forced removal route of our northern route. So we have a number of them, but one in particular, the bicyclists retrace every summer. And Savannah Hicks did the Remember the Removal ride back in 2015. She now works over at the hospital, and she was a student at Tennessee, and after she graduated, she came back and gave a talk. And one of the things that she said to me that stuck out to me and made its way into the book, on my chapter on Savannah, is she said that when she got to the last day, and Savannah has only lived here, this is her home. These mountains are her home. You know, she descends from people who were not forcibly removed, who got to keep their life here. And she said to me that the hardest day for her was the day that she was going to last see the mountains. And that she turned around and she looked at those mountains and she wept. In 2015. And I thought, that feels human. To turn around and look at a place that you might never see again, or you're going to see again, but it's going to look different to you, or it may not be the same, or you may not be the same person you were. It's pretty human. And so to take Savannah, and so what I did with what Savannah described to me is I said, did a yoka do that? When she looked at these mountains one last time, and I don't know, but I think we can all kind of think about the fact that whether it's a yoka or whether it's people being forced west on the Trail of Tears under gunpoint or under severe duress, that they may have stopped to look at those mountains one more time, to take them in, to try to remember them, and they may have wept. And so how do I let Cherokee Voices today guide how I think about an earlier moment that is not just about Cherokee people, that is about humanity? So the other places that I just had kind of discoveries, so hopefully I'm not alone in this. I had no idea what the word mollicology was until I wrote this book. So some of you may be much smarter than I am, and good, some of you may not know what that word is. I hope, join me. It's the study of mollusks. And there's an exhibit over at McClung Museum. For a long time, McClung had a really robust set of archaeologists who worked on mollusks and the river systems in this region. And I was waiting on Tim Bowman to kind of meet me to do some research in the archaeology lab. And this was after I'd left Tennessee. I was at Penn State. And I was just looking at the exhibit downstairs, and I was like, oh, I guess, mollusks are kind of important to this region. But I didn't think about them, in part because of environmental change. That the river systems around here used to be teeming with incredibly diverse mollusks. And it wasn't until the early 20th century with industrial runoff that we lost that mollusk diversity. So Tim Bowman took me over to the off-site facility where they keep a lot of that TVA material. And he showed me row after row of shell that hadn't been opened since it was pulled out of those sites when TVA went in 50, 60, 70 years ago. And I opened up one of these bags of shell, and the rubber bands fell apart because they're just deteriorating. Nobody's looked at this stuff. It's ubiquitous, right? So this also forced me to say, like, everybody's handling shell in some way. Everyone is contending with mollusks. It also helps that early travelers through the region said you couldn't step foot in the river without walking across it on mollusks. Piled up in the river systems. So the documents tell us that this was a different place. And when I'm handling a shell, it's coming off on my hands. The powder is getting everywhere. And one of the big differences that we see in pottery and the move in the Mississippian period is the move toward using shell as pottery temper. So it had been largely limestone, but you increasingly see the use of shell to temper pottery. And so here you can see my hand covered in powder in this warehouse. And what do? I wipe it on my jeans, right? It's getting everywhere because it's all over my hands. So anything I touch, okay? So now that I've gone down this rabbit hole of girls, I'm thinking, what would kids do? Whether it's just a matter of like putting it on each other or touching things and thinking it's funny, or what are they doing with this shell when they're getting this pottery, this powder all over them? And then Tim Bowman says, well, let me pull out some material, some of these site reports from Cherokee and Tanasi that are not in the published materials. They're in the kind of behind the scenes stuff that McClung holds. And on that diagram in the middle there, this is a home site at Cherokee and Tanasi that's dated to the mid-18th century. And there is a section of the site which was in a domestic structure, so within a home. It's a 5-foot by 3-foot section, and it was pottery. It was a shell being processed within that home. And I thought to myself, who's doing work in homes? Women and children. Men are at the council house, men are off doing things, hunting, men are off elsewhere. The work of the home was women and children. So there's a set of kids, older kids, younger kids, moms overseeing this, aunties are overseeing this. They're steaming open these mollusks. They're getting them ready to process for pottery. They're probably pulling out the meat inside to use in soups to supplement. And they're getting powder all over their hands, and they're stacking shells, and they're making noise, and they're giggling. And maybe mom's telling some stories to them about the role of shells, of the role of spirals, of the role of, so I go back and kind of recreate a scene of what this might have looked like. Do I know this happened? Not absolutely, but I know that little kids and moms were doing this work in a mid-18th century home. I know that I couldn't resist getting that powder everywhere. They couldn't either. Like, that would have been the reality of processing those materials. So these are the ways that I kind of took what I kind of could think about and imagine side by side with the documentary record to think about the lives of children, young people in those earlier moments. So the other way that I had to think about this is I think in words, I think in books I read, I think in, I've said I'm not an artist. So one of the things that I did is I don't have images for the girls that I create kind of out of this kind of imagining around the materials I have available to them, kind of reconstructing what this educational world might have looked like. And so I asked Roy Boney Jr., who's a Cherokee Nation artist, to create images for me in order for us to see what these girls might have looked like. And so I didn't give him a lot of direction, but one of the things I did ask him to do is I said, please make Ayoka older than 6. Can we let her grow up in the image? And so he agreed to do that. Why did I name this girl at Cherokee and Tanasi Climber of Trees? Because a traveler's account said Climber of Trees was a really common girl's name amongst Cherokee people in the 18th century. And again, for any of us that have spent any time around children, we know that lots of kids are compelled to climb trees. It's not just about Cherokee girls in the 18th century. It's about kids throughout time, right? But thinking about these educational landscapes and what they would have looked like, and thinking about the kinds of choices that were available to kids. If you wanted to be a cake maker, how did you get access? Who did you learn from? How did you have to learn yourself? How did you have to demonstrate your competency to the teachers to get them to really take you under their wing? What did everybody have to know? Everybody had to know how to think about pottery. Everybody had to know how to think about deer skins and hide processing. So nobody escaped that. But not everybody needed to know every skill. So what would it look like to try and get those skills? What would college have looked like, in a moment before college? Advanced learning. And so I really wanted to take seriously both, again, the kind of voices of Cherokee people today and what insights they could offer me, because these things continue, as well as the archaeology itself, that I don't want to dismiss the power of the materials we have available to us and what we can know from those materials. And the final thing, I always end this way because it is, to me, it is a powerful part of how I thought about this book, and I haven't said enough about language. There's a group out in the Cherokee Nation called Little Cherokee Seeds, and the premise of this program, it's not run by the Cherokee Nation, it's kind of a ground-up program that was started by women in the community. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to think about how to educate our babies in the language that 400 years ago, 250 years ago, how did you learn the Cherokee language and who did you learn it from? You learned it at your mother's breast. You learned it from your older siblings who were right next to you. You learned it from your aunties who you were being passed to. You learned it from your grandmother who's in the home from you. And it helped that I had two people out here, some of you may know these folks. Tom Belt, who is a Cherokee Nation guy, but he's been hanging around these mountains for about 30 years now because he's married to Rosanna Belt, who's Eastern Band, and is a first language Cherokee speaker. And Gil Jackson, who's another first language speaker who lives out here. And they both said to me, independently of one another, they said, I don't know that I'd be a Cherokee speaker today if it hadn't been for my mother teaching me Cherokee from the time I was born. So this program has started pulling babies in with their moms, and their moms don't always know Cherokee, but they've brought together a series of first language speakers, one of whom is my aunt. And she's been doing language work for a long time, but I've never seen her more happy than doing this work. And they spend 9 to 5 together out at a place called Camp 7 Star. And what do they do all day? They cook, they sing songs, they go out and garden, they gather, they hang out with elders, they learn to make clay beads for jewelry. They are doing all of these things together day in, day out to create a new generation of speakers starting when they're babies, not waiting until they're immersion school age, not waiting until they're in high school, starting from the moment they're arriving in the world. And one of the powerful things that I think about this group is that when I watched a presentation on that this group did at a conference out in Oklahoma, and I'm watching all these women who are not these babies' moms or aunts, but they're all just passing these babies from one set of arms to another. And the dads are out in the audience, and occasionally they would come intervene with one of the toddlers, but generally it's the moms, it's the aunties, it's the speakers kind of caring for these children on stage. And I thought to myself in that moment, I am watching the past play out for the future. That if I were to imagine how Cherokee children learned the Cherokee language, it would have looked a lot like what I saw on that stage. Identical? No. But I was looking to something here and now that is moving us into the future in order to see something that was really important. And that's kind of a beautiful moment, and also is the kind of way that I've tried to conceive of this project more broadly, by thinking about these lands, by thinking about the people who lived on these lands, by thinking about the people who continue to live on these lands, and the ways that the land itself forces us to kind of have an education of it. And the ways that we're not getting that education from the land anymore because mollusks aren't as ubiquitous as they once were in our river systems. Or Carolina parakeets don't fly through the sky anymore. Or that chestnut trees don't tower over us the way that they once did. And so how do we think about these educational landscapes that were a part of Cherokee people's lives and a part of the relationships they had, but also the ways that we conceive of children's education over time? So I'm going to stop there, and I want to thank you all. So, and
Thank you for your talk. I have more of a comment than a question at this point. I just loved hearing you talk with your question. That was just such a neat approach of how your thought process went, and that just carried me along through all the different the topics and the characters in your book and all the documentation, and it was just lovely, the how and the why and the what. It was just really clever.
thank you. Yeah, I mean, really, when we write books, I mean, my first book was very different. It was kind of like, this happened, and this, I mean, hopefully, as my daughter said, she read the introduction to the book over the winter break, and she said to me, so if you hadn't gone into caves, you would have written another boring book. But how do you, how do you tell these really complex and really long histories that are not, that are comprehensible, but that can be digestible? It's nearly impossible to know everything, but we can know some things. And so how do we, for me, this was very much in order to write this book, I had a lot to learn, and that part of it was a kind of continual learning. And I think, that's one thing, we should all continue to be students of the world and students of our communities and students of everything around us. But I think we get trapped in the ways of I have a PhD, Dr. Julie Reed, but I don't know anything. I don't know anything. And so without the people who know more than me or know different things than me, I couldn't have written this book. And so I feel like I need to also, kind of oh, my name's on the book, but I could not have written this book without Savannah Hicks, without Tim Bowman, without Brett Rick. The kind of idea that I'm so smart and produce this by myself is a lie. And that part of it is a learning process that I had to go through as a student as I wrote the book. And that feels honest to me, as opposed to kind of, I just knew all this stuff and I put it in the book. Yeah, no. I didn't know anything. Yeah.
Part of me has not left the cave that you were in.
Me neither.
And I keep staring at the ceiling of the cave and wondering about that syllabary. I'm wondering how old it is. I'm wondering who put that up there. This predated Sequoia.
It's contemporaneous with Sequoia.
Okay, contemporaneous. Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe